Welcome to the J.W. Jupiter Readers Theater, which proudly presents the first chapter of Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff. The Right Stuff follows the birth of Project Mercury, the United States' first human spaceflight program. But before Tom Wolfe can talk about astronauts, he must first talk about the harrowing life and cocksure attitudes of military test pilots in the early jet age. This is the breeding ground of sorts from which those astronauts were ultimately selected. Whether these test pilots were animated by stoic bravery or by a delusional braggadocio, I'll let you be the judge of that. But to not get any further out in front of the pleasure and presence of Tom Wolfe's art. The Right Stuff, Chapter 1. The Angels. Within 5 minutes, or 10 minutes, no more than that, 3 of the others had called her on the telephone to ask her if she had heard that something had happened out there. "Jane, this is Alice. Listen, I just got a call from Betty, and she heard something's happened out there. Have you heard anything?" That was the way they phrased it, call after call. She picked up the telephone and began relaying the same message to some of the others. "Connie, this is Jane Conrad. Alice just called me, and she says something's happened." Something was part of the official wife lingo for tiptoeing blindfolded around the subject. Being barely 21 years old and new around here, Jane Conrad knew very little about this particular subject, since nobody ever talked about it. But the day was young, and what a setting she had for her imminent enlightenment, and what a picture she herself presented. Jane was tall and slender, and had rich brown hair and high cheekbones and wide brown eyes. She looked a little like the actress Jean Simmons. Her father was a rancher in southwestern Texas. She had gone east to college, to Bryn Mawr, and had met her husband, Pete, at a debutante's party at the Gulf Mills Club in Philadelphia, when he was a senior at Princeton. Pete was a short, wiry blond boy who joked around a lot. At any moment his face was likely to break into a wild grin, revealing the gap between his front teeth. The hickory kid sort he was. A hickory kid on the Deb circuit, however. He had an air of energy, self-confidence, ambition, joie de vivre. Jane and Pete were married 2 days after he graduated from Princeton. Last year, Jane gave birth to their first child, Peter. And today, here in Florida, in Jacksonville, in the peaceful year 1955, the sun shines through the pines outside, and the very air takes on the sparkle of the ocean. The ocean and a great mica-white beach are less than a mile away. Anyone driving by will see Jane's little house gleaming like a dream house in the pines. It is a brick house, but Jane and Pete painted the bricks white so that it gleams in the sun against a great green screen of pine trees with 1,000 little places where the sun peeks through. They painted the shutters black, which makes the white walls look even more brilliant. The house has only 1,100 square feet of floor space, but Jane and Pete designed it themselves, and that more than makes up for the size. A friend of theirs was the builder and gave them every possible break so that it cost only $11,000. Outside, the sun shines, and inside, the fever rises by the minute as 5, 10, 15, and finally nearly all 20 of the wives join the circuit, trying to find out what has happened. Which, in fact, means, to whose husband? After 30 minutes on such a circuit, this is not an unusual morning around here, a wife begins to feel that the telephone is no longer located on a table or on the kitchen wall. It is exploding in her solar plexus. Yet it would be far worse right now to hear the front doorbell. The protocol is strict on that point, although written down nowhere. No woman is supposed to deliver the final news, and certainly not on the telephone. The matter mustn't be bungled, that's the idea. No, a man should bring the news when the time comes, a man with some official or moral authority, a clergyman or a comrade of the newly deceased. Furthermore, he should bring the bad news in person. He should turn up at the front door and ring the bell, and be standing there like a pillar of coolness and competence, bearing the bad news on ice, like a fish. Therefore, all the telephone calls from the wives were the frantic and portentous beating of the wings of the death angels, as it were. When the final news came, there would be a ring at the front door. A wife in this situation finds herself staring at the front door as if she no longer owns it or controls it, and outside the door would be a man, come to inform her that unfortunately something has happened out there, and her husband's body now lies incinerated in the swamps, or the pines, or the palmetto grass, burned beyond recognition, which anyone who has been around an air base for very long, fortunately, Jane had not, realized was quite an artful euphemism to describe a human body that now looked like an enormous fowl that has burned up in a stove, burned a blackish brown all over, greasy and blistered, fried, in a word, with not only the entire face and all the hair and the ears burned off, not to mention all the clothing, but also the hands and feet, with what remains of the arms and legs bent at the knees and elbows and burned into absolutely rigid angles, burned a greasy blackish brown like the bursting body itself, so that this husband, father, officer, gentleman, this ornamentum of some mother's eye, his Majesty the baby of just 20-odd years back, has been reduced to a charred hulk with wings and shanks sticking out of it. My own husband. How could this be what they were talking about? Jane had heard the young men, Pete among them, talk about other young men who had bought it, or augured in, or crunched, but it had never been anyone they knew, no one in the squadron. And in any event, the way they talked about it with such breezy, slangy terminology was the same way they talked about sports. It was as if they were saying, "He was thrown out stealing second base," and that was all. Not one word, not in print, not in conversation, not in this amputated language, about an incinerated corpse, from which a young man's spirit has vanished in an instant, from which all smiles, gestures, moods, worries, laughters, wiles, shrugs, tenderness, and loving looks, you, my love, have disappeared like a sigh, while the terror consumes a cottage in the woods, and a young woman, sizzling with the fever, awaits her confirmation as the new widow of the day. The next series of calls greatly increased the possibility that it was Pete to whom something had happened. There were only 20 men in the squadron, and soon 9 or 10 had been accounted for by the fluttering reports of the death angels. Knowing that the word was out that an accident had occurred, husbands who could get to a telephone were calling home to say, "It didn't happen to me." This news, of course, was immediately fed to the fever. James' telephone would ring once more, and one of the wives would be saying, "Nancy just got a call from Jack. He's at the squadron. He says something's happened, but he doesn't know what. He said he saw Frank D. take off about 10 minutes ago with Greg and back, so they're all right. What have you heard?" But Jane has heard nothing, except that other husbands, and not hers, are safe and accounted for. And thus, on a sunny day in Florida, outside of the Jacksonville Naval Air Station, in a little white cottage, a veritable dream house, another beautiful young woman was about to be apprised of the quid pro quo of her husband's line of work, of the trade-off, as one might say, the sub-paragraphs of a contract written in no visible form. Just as surely as if she had the entire roster in front of her, Jane now realized that only 2 men in the squadron were unaccounted for. One was a pilot named Bud Jennings. The other was Pete. She picked up the telephone and did something that was much frowned on in a time of emergency. She called the squadron office. The duty officer answered. "I want to speak to Lieutenant Conrad," said Jane. "This is Mrs. Conrad." "I'm sorry," the duty officer said, and then his voice cracked. Sorry. He couldn't find the words. He was about to cry. He can't come to the phone. He can't come to the phone. It's very important," said Jane. "I'm sorry. It's impossible." The duty officer could hardly get the words out because he was so busy gulping back sobs. Sobs. "He can't come to the phone." "Why not? Where is he?" "I'm sorry." More sighs, wheezes, snuffling gasps. I can't tell you that. I have to hang up now." And the duty officer's voice disappeared in a great surf of emotion, and he hung up. The duty officer, the very sound of her voice, was more than he could take. The world froze, congealed in that moment. Jane could no longer calculate the interval before the front doorbell would ring, and some competent, long-faced figure would appear, some friend of widows and orphans, who would inform her, officially, that Pete was dead. Even out in the middle of the swamp, in this rot bog of pine trunks, scum slicks, dead dodder vines, and mosquito eggs, even out in this great overripe sump, the smell of burned beyond recognition obliterated everything else. When airplane fuel exploded, it created a heat so intense that everything but the hardest metals not only burned, everything of rubber, plastic, celluloid, wood, leather, cloth, flesh, gristle, calcium, horn, hair, blood, and protoplasm, it not only burned, it gave up the ghost in the form of every stricken putrid gas known to chemistry. One could smell the horror. It came in through the nostrils and burned the rhinal cavities raw and penetrated the liver and permeated the bowels like a black gas until there was nothing in the universe, inside or out, except the stench of the char. As the helicopter came down between the pine trees and settled onto the bogs, the smell hit Pete Conrad even before the hatch was completely open, and they were not even close enough to see the wreckage yet. The rest of the way, Conrad and the crewmen had to travel on foot. After a few steps, the water was up to their knees, and then it was up to their armpits, and they kept wading through the water and the scum and the vines and the pine trunks, but it was nothing compared to the smell. Conrad, a 25-year-old lieutenant junior grade, happened to be on duty as squadron safety officer that day, and was supposed to make the on-site investigation of the crash. The fact was, however, that this squadron was the first duty assignment of his career, and he had never been at a crash site before, and had never smelled any such revolting stench or seen anything like what awaited him. When Conrad finally reached the plane, which was an SNJ, he found the fuselage burned and blistered and dug into the swamp with one wing sheared off, and the cockpit canopy smashed. In the front seat was all that was left of his friend Bud Jennings. Bud Jennings, an amiable fellow, a promising young fighter pilot, was now a horrible roasted hulk with no head. His head was completely gone, apparently torn off the spinal column like a pineapple off a stalk, except that it was nowhere to be found. Conrad stood there soaking wet in the swamp bog, wondering what the hell to do. It was a struggle to move 20 feet in this freaking muck. Every time he looked up, he was looking into a delirium of limbs, vines, dappled shadows, and a chopped-up white light that came through the treetops. The ubiquitous screen of trees with 1,000 little places where the sun peeked through. Nevertheless, he started wading back out into the muck and the scum, and the others followed. He kept looking up. Gradually, he could make it out. Up in the treetops, there was a pattern of broken limbs where the S&J had come crashing through. It was like a tunnel through the treetops. Conrad and the others began splashing through the swamp, following the strange path 90 or 100 feet above them. It took a sharp turn. That must have been where the wing broke off. The trail veered to one side and started downward. They kept looking up and wading through the muck. Then they stopped. There was a great green sap wound up there in the middle of a tree trunk. It was odd. Near the huge gash was tree disease. Some sort of brownish, lumpy sac up in the branches, such as you see in trees infested by bagworms. And there were yellowish curds on the branches around it, and the disease had caused the sap to ooze out and fester and congeal. Except that it couldn't be sap, because it was streaked with blood. In the next instant, Conrad didn't have to say a word. Each man could see it all. The lumpy sack was the cloth liner of a flight helmet, with the earphones attached to it. The curds were Bud Jennings' brains. The tree trunk had smashed through the cockpit canopy of the S&J and knocked Bud Jennings' head to pieces like a melon. In keeping with the protocol, the squadron commander was not going to release Bud Jennings' name until his widow, Loretta, had been located and a competent male death messenger had been dispatched to tell her. But Loretta Jennings was not at home and could not be found. Hence a delay and more than enough time for the other wives, the death angels, to burn with panic over the telephone lines. All the pilots were accounted for, except the two who were in the woods, Bud Jennings and Pete Conrad. One chance and two, acey-deucey, one finger, two finger, and this was not an unusual day around here. Loretta Jennings had been at a shopping center. When she returned home, a certain figure was waiting outside. A man, a solemn friend of widows and orphans, and it was Loretta Jennings who lost the game of odd and even, acey-deucey, and it was Loretta whose child, she was pregnant with a second, would have no father. It was this young woman who went through all the final horrors that Jane Conrad had imagined, assumed, would be hers to endure forever. Yet this grim stroke of fortune brought Jane little relief. On the day of Bud Jennings's funeral, Pete went into the back of the closet and brought out his bridge coat, per regulations. This was the most stylish item in the Navy officer's wardrobe. Pete had never had occasion to wear his before. It was a double-breasted coat made of navy blue Melton cloth and came down almost to the ankles. It must have weighed 10 pounds. It had a double row of gold buttons down the front and loops for shoulder boards, big, beautiful belly-cut collar and lapels, deep turnbacks on the sleeves, a tailored waist, and a center vent in back that ran from the waistline to the bottom of the coat. Never would Pete, or for that matter, many other American males in the mid-20th century, have an article of clothing quite so impressive and aristocratic as that bridge coat. At the funeral, the 19 little Indians who were left, Navy boys, lined up manfully in their bridge coats. They looked so young. Their pink, lineless faces with their absolutely clear, lean jaw lines popped up bravely, correctly, out of the enormous belly-cut collars of the bridge coats. They sang an old Navy hymn, which slipped into a strange and lugubrious minor key here and there, and included a stanza added especially for aviators. It ended with, "Oh, hear us when we lift our prayer for those in peril in the air." 3 months later, another member of the squadron crashed and was burned beyond recognition, and Pete hauled out the bridge coat again, and Jane saw 18 little Indians bravely going through the motions at the funeral. Not long after that, Pete was transferred from Jacksonville to the Patuxent River Naval Air Station in Maryland. Pete and Jane had barely settled in there when they got word that another member of the Jacksonville squadron, a close friend of theirs, someone they had had over to dinner many times, had died trying to take off from the deck of a carrier in a routine practice session a few miles out in the Atlantic. The catapult that propelled aircraft off the deck lost pressure, and his ship just dribbled off the end of the deck, with its engine roaring vainly, and fell 60 feet into the ocean and sank like a brick, and he vanished just like that. Pete had been transferred to Patuxent River, which was known in Navy vernacular as Pax River, to enter the Navy's new test pilot school. This was considered a major step up in the career of a young Navy aviator. Now that the Korean War was over and there was no combat flying, all the hot young pilots aimed for flight test. In the military, they always said flight test and not test flying. Jet aircraft had been in use for barely 10 years at the time, and the Navy was testing new jet fighters continually. Pax River was the Navy's prime test center. Jane liked the house they bought at Pax River. She didn't like it as much as the little house in Jacksonville, but then she and Pete hadn't designed this one. They lived in a community called Northtown Creek, 6 miles from the base. Northtown Creek, like the base, was on a scrub pine peninsula that stuck out into Chesapeake Bay. They were tucked in amid the pine trees, once more. All around were rhododendron bushes. Pete's classwork and his flying duties were very demanding. Everyone in his flight test class, Group 20, talked about how difficult it was, and obviously loved it. Because in Navy flying, this was the big league. The young men in Group 20 and their wives were Pete's and Jane's entire social world. They associated with no one else. They constantly invited each other to dinner during the week. There was a group party at someone's house practically every weekend, and they would go off on outings to fish or water ski in Chesapeake Bay. In a way, they could not have associated with anyone else, at least not easily, because the boys could only talk about one thing: their flying. One of the phrases that kept running through the conversation was pushing the outside of the envelope. The envelope was a flight test term referring to the limits of a particular aircraft's performance, how tight a turn it could make at such and such a speed, and so on. Pushing the outside, probing the outer limits of the envelope seemed to be the great challenge and satisfaction of flight test. At first, pushing the outside of the envelope was not a particularly terrifying phrase to hear. It sounded, once more, as if the boys were just talking about sports. Then one sunny day, a member of the group, one of the happy lads they always had dinner with and drank with and went water skiing with, was coming in for a landing at the base in an A-3J attack plane. He let his airspeed fall too low before he extended his flaps, and the ship stalled out and he crashed and was burned beyond recognition. And they brought out the bridge coats and sang about those in peril in the air, and put the bridge coats away, and the Indians who had left talked about the accident after dinner one night. They shook their heads and said it was a damn shame, but he should have known better than to wait so long before lowering the flaps. Barely a week had gone by before another member of the group was coming in for a landing in the same type of aircraft, the A3J, making a 90-degree turn to his final approach, and something went wrong with the controls, and he ended up with one rear stabilizer wing up and the other one down, and his ship rolled in like a corkscrew from 800 feet up and crashed, and he was burned beyond recognition. And the bridgecoats came out, and they sang about those in peril in the air, and then they put the bridgecoats away, and after dinner one night they mentioned that the departed had been a good man, but was inexperienced, and when the malfunction in the controls put him in that bad corner, he didn't know how to get out of it. Every wife wanted to cry out, "Well, my God, the machine broke! What makes any of you think you would have come out of it any better?" Yet intuitively Jane and the rest of them knew it wasn't right, even to suggest that. Pete never indicated for a moment that he thought any such thing could possibly happen to him. It seemed not only wrong, but dangerous to challenge a young pilot's confidence by posing the question. And that, too, was part of the unofficial protocol for the officer's wife. From now on, every time Pete was late coming in from the flight line, she would worry. She began to wonder if, no, assume, he had found his way into one of those corners they all talked about so spiritedly, one of those little dead ends that so enlivened conversation around here. Not long after that, another good friend of theirs went up in an F-4, the Navy's newest and hottest fighter plane, known as the Phantom. He reached 20,000 feet, and then nosed over and dove straight into Chesapeake Bay. It turned out that a hose connection was missing in his oxygen system, and he had suffered hypoxia and passed out at the high altitude. And the bridgecoats came out, and they lifted a prayer about those in peril in the air, and the bridgecoats were put away, and the little Indians were incredulous. How could anybody fail to check his hose connections? How could anybody be in such poor condition as to pass out that quickly from hypoxia? A couple of days later, Jane was standing at the window of her house in Northtown Creek. She saw some smoke rise above the pines from over in the direction of the flight line. Just that, a column of smoke. No explosion or sirens or any other sound. She went to another room, so as not to have to think about it, but there was no explanation for the smoke. She went back to the window. In the yard of a house across the street, she saw a group of people standing there and looking at her house, as if trying to decide what to do. Jane looked away, but she couldn't keep from looking out again. She caught a glimpse of a certain figure coming up the walkway toward her front door. She knew exactly who it was. She had had nightmares like this, and yet this was no dream. She was wide awake and alert, never more alert in her entire life, frozen, completely defeated by the sight. She simply waited for the bell to ring. She waited, but there was not a sound. Finally, she could stand it no more. In real life, unlike her dream life, Jane was both too self-possessed and too polite to scream through the door, "Go away!" So she opened it. There was no one there, no one at all. There was no group of people on the lawn across the way, and no one to be seen for 100 yards in any direction along the lawns and the leafy rhododendron roads of Northtown Creek. Then began a cycle in which she had both the nightmares and the hallucinations, continually. Anything could touch off an hallucination. A ball of smoke, a telephone ring that stopped before she could answer it, the sound of a siren, even the sound of trucks starting up, crash trucks. Then she would glance out the window and a certain figure would be coming up the walk, and she would wait for the bell. The only difference between the dreams and the hallucinations was that the scene of the dreams was always the little white house in Jacksonville. In both cases, the feeling that this time it has happened was quite real. The star pilot in the class behind Pete's, a young man who was the main rival of their good friend Al Bean, went up in a fighter to do some power dive tests. One of the most demanding disciplines in flight test was to accustom yourself to making precise readings from the control panel in the same moment that you were pushing the outside of the envelope. This young man put his ship into the test dive and was still reading out the figures with diligence and precision and great discipline when he augured straight into the oyster flats and was burned beyond recognition. And the bridgecoats came out, and they sang about those in peril in the air, and the bridgecoats were put away, and the little Indians remarked that the departed was a swell guy and a brilliant student of flying. A little too much of a student, in fact. He hadn't bothered to look out the window at the real world soon enough. Beano, Al Bean, wasn't quite so brilliant. On the other hand, he was still here. Like many other wives in Group 20, Jane wanted to talk about the whole situation, the incredible series of fatal accidents with her husband and the other members of the group, to find out how they were taking it. But somehow, the unwritten protocol forbade discussions of this subject, which was the fear of death. Nor could Jane or any of the rest of them really have a talk, with anyone around the base. You could talk to another wife about being worried, but what good did it do? Who wasn't worried? You were likely to get a look that said, "Why dwell on it?" Jane might have gotten away with divulging the matter of the nightmares, but hallucinations? There was no room in Navy life for any such anomalous tendency as that. By now the bad string had reached 10 in all, and almost all of the dead had been close friends of Pete and Jane, young men who had been in their house many times, young men who had sat across from Jane and chattered like the rest of them about the grand adventure of military flying. And the survivors still sat around as before, with the same inexplicable exhilaration. Jane kept watching Pete for some sign that his spirit was cracking, but she saw none. He talked a mile a minute, kidded and joked, laughed with his hickory kid cackle he always had. He still enjoyed the company of members of the group like Wally Shearer and Jim Lovell. Many young pilots were taciturn and cut loose with the strange fervor of this business only in the air. But Pete and Wally and Jim were not reticent, not in any situation. They loved to kid around. Pete called Jim Lovell shaky, because it was the last thing a pilot would want to be called. Wally Shearer was outgoing to the point of hearty. He loved practical jokes and dreadful puns and so on. The three of them, even in the midst of this bad string, would love to get on a subject such as accident-prone Mitch Johnson. Accident-prone Mitch Johnson, it seemed, was a Navy pilot whose life was in the hands of two angels, one of them bad and the other one good. The bad angel would put him into accidents that would have annihilated any ordinary pilot, and the good angel would bring him out of them without a scratch. Just the other day, this was the sort of story Jane would hear them tell, Mitch Johnson was coming into land on a carrier. But he came in short, missed the flight deck, and crashed into the fantail below the deck. There was a tremendous explosion, and the rear half of the plane fell into the water in flames. Everyone on the flight deck said, "Poor Johnson. The good angel was off duty." They were still debating how to remove the debris and his mortal remains when a phone rang on the bridge. A somewhat dopey voice said, "Hey, this is Johnson. Say, listen, I'm down here in the supply hold, and the hatch is locked, and I can't find the lights, and I can't see a goddamn thing, and I tripped over a cable, and I think I hurt my leg." The officer on the bridge slammed the phone down, then vowed to find out what morbid son of a bitch could pull a phone prank at a time like this. Then the phone rang again, and the man with the dopey voice managed to establish the fact that he was, indeed, Mitch Johnson. The good angel had not left his side. When he smashed into the fantail, he hit some empty ammunition drums, and they cushioned the impact, leaving him groggy but not seriously hurt. The fuselage had blown to pieces, so he just stepped out onto the fantail and opened a hatch that led into the supply hold. It was pitch black in there, and there were cables all across the floor holding down spare aircraft engines. Accident-prone Mitch Johnson kept tripping over these cables until he found a telephone. Sure enough, the one injury he had was a bruised shin from tripping over a cable. The man was accident-prone. Pete and Wally and Jim absolutely cracked up over stories like this. It was amazing. Great sports yarns. Nothing more than that. A few days later, Jane was out shopping at the Pax River Commissary on Sanders Road, near the main gate to the base. She heard the sirens go off at the field, and then she heard the engines of the crash truck start up. This time Jane was determined to keep calm. Every instinct made her want to rush home, but she forced herself to stay in the commissary and continue shopping. For 30 minutes she went through the motions of completing her shopping list. Then she drove home to Northtown Creek. As she reached the house, she saw a figure going up the sidewalk. It was a man. Even from the back there was no question as to who he was. He had on a black suit, and there was a white band around his neck. It was her minister from the Episcopal Church. She stared, and this vision did not come and go. The figure kept on walking up the front walk. She was not asleep now, and she was not inside her house glancing out the front window. She was outside in her car, in front of her house. She was not dreaming, and she was not hallucinating, and the figure kept walking up toward her front door. The commotion at the field was over one of the most extraordinary things that even veteran pilots had ever seen at Pax River. And they had all seen it, because practically the entire flight line had gathered out on the field for it, as if it had been an air show. Conrad's friend Ted Whalen had taken a fighter up, and on takeoff there had been a structural failure that caused a hydraulic leak. A red warning light showed up on Whalen's panel, and he had a talk with the ground. It was obvious that the leak would cripple the controls before he could get the ship back down to the field for a landing. He would have to bail out. The only question was where and when, and so they had a talk about that. They decided that he should jump at 8,100 feet at such and such a speed directly over the field. The plane would crash into the Chesapeake Bay, and he would float down to the field. Just as coolly as anyone could have asked for it, Ted Whalen lined the ship up to come across the field at 8,100 feet precisely, and he punched out, ejected. Down on the field, they all had their faces turned up to the sky. They saw Whalen pop out of the cockpit. With his Martin Baker seat parachute rig strapped on, he looked like a little black geometric lump 1.5 miles up in the blue. They watched him as he started dropping. Everyone waited for the parachute to open. They waited a few more seconds, and then they waited some more. The little shape was getting bigger and picking up tremendous speed. Then there came an unspeakable instant at which everyone on the field who knew anything about parachute jumps knew what was going to happen. Yet even for them, it was an unearthly feeling, for no one had ever seen such a thing happen so close up, from start to finish, from what amounted to a grandstand seat. Now the shape was going so fast and coming so close it began to play tricks on the eyes. It seemed to stretch out. It became much bigger and hurtled toward them at a terrific speed until they couldn't make out its actual outlines at all. Finally, there was just a streaking black blur before their eyes, followed by what seemed like an explosion. Except that it was not an explosion. It was the tremendous crack of Ted Whalen, his helmet, his pressure suit, and his seat parachute rig smashing into the center of the runway, precisely on target, right in front of the crowd. An absolute bullseye. Ted Whalen had no doubt been alive until the instant of impact. He had had about 30 seconds to watch the Pax River base and the peninsula and Baltimore County and continental America and the entire comprehensible world rise up to smash him. When they lifted his body up off the concrete, it was like a sack of fertilizer. Pete took out the bridge coat again, and he and Jane and all the little Indians went to the funeral for Ted Whalen. That it hadn't been Pete was not solace enough for Jane. That the preacher had not, in fact, come to her front door as the solemn friend of widows and orphans, but merely for a church call, had not brought peace and relief. That Pete still didn't show the slightest indication of thinking that any unkind fate awaited him no longer lent her even a moment's courage. The next dream and the next hallucination and the next merely seemed more real. For she now knew the subject and the essence of this enterprise, even though not a word of it had passed anybody's lips. She even knew why Pete, the Princeton boy she met at a deb party at the Gulf Mills Club, would never quit, never withdraw from this grim business, unless in a coffin. And God knew, and she knew, there was a coffin waiting for each little Indian. 7 years later, when a reporter and a photographer from Life magazine actually stood near her in her living room and watched her face, while outside on the lawn, a crowd of television crewmen and newspaper reporters waited for a word, an indication, anything, perhaps a glimpse through a part in a curtain, waited for some sign of what she felt, when one and all asked with their ravenous eyes and occasionally in so many words, "How do you feel?" and "Are you scared? America wants to know." It made Jane want to laugh, but in fact, she couldn't even manage a smile. "Why ask now?" she wanted to say. But they wouldn't have had the faintest notion of what she was talking about. Thank you for visiting the J.W. Jupiter Readers Theater. Let me know your thoughts on this excerpt of The Right Stuff in the comments below, and please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed what you heard. And I'll see you soon on another J.W. Jupiter reading adventure.